So I'm Jolie Straseski, and I am one of the medical directors here at ARUP Laboratories. I'm the medical director of endocrinology, and today I'm going to talk about measuring thyroglobulin and how we can actually measure for that particular analyte in the presence of anti-thyroglobulin autoantibodies, which have traditionally been somewhat of an issue for this particular assay. So we're going to talk about this marker, thyroglobulin. We're going to talk about why we would even measure it in the first place. We'll talk about some of the measurement challenges that exist. I'll introduce one way that we can actually avoid some of these issues, and then I'll provide a cost analysis that we've recently performed that tells us when using this test is actually most cost effective. You can probably tell from the name, thyroglobulin is secreted by the thyroid gland, which you can see in the figure here is right in the front of the neck. It actually acts as a precursor to the thyroid hormones, so T3 and T4, you might be more familiar with those hormones. It's a relatively large protein found as a dimer, which you can see from the ribbon diagram here, and it has many epitopes that antibodies can bind to, and as you might be able to imagine, that can be an issue, so we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. So why would we ever even measure thyroglobulin in the first place? So one of the main applications has to do with thyroid cancer. So thyroid cancer is actually the most common tumor of the endocrine system, makes up 90% of all endocrine cancers, and it's the most rapidly increasing cancer in the United States. And so as you can see on the right-hand side with the graph there, you can see the trajectory of new cases. So this is only graphed up through 2012. It's predominantly diagnosed in younger individuals, so those under the age of 55, and about 75% of all diagnoses are in women, so women are diagnosed more than men are. What's interesting is that despite all of this, thyroid cancer has actually had a relatively low death rate compared to other cancers. Again, you can also see that in the graph on the right-hand side there. The death rate has actually stayed remarkably stable and overall very low. The 5-year survival rate is actually 98%. This is due to the fact that thyroid cancer is often very treatable. So to treat thyroid cancer, in most cases, the thyroid is either fully or partially resected or removed. Remember that thyroglobulin is secreted only by the thyroid gland, which makes it very specific. And so that means in certain cases we can use it as a biomarker then to signal cancer recurrence after someone's had their thyroid resected or after treatment. So if it's present in an individual that's had their thyroid removed or ablated, that can indicate cancer recurrence. So therefore, post-treatment, patients are monitored oftentimes every 6 to 12 months, depends on the guidelines, but concentrations above approximately 2 nanograms per mil may indicate residual or recurrent disease. Again, it depends on the guidelines that are used. Remember, we've mentioned that thyroglobulin is a large protein, has many different epitopes that antibodies can bind to, and so that actually turns into a bit of an issue when we talk about measuring thyroglobulin. With all those nice epitopes hanging out there, it's logical that the body might actually create its own antibodies against thyroglobulin. So these autoantibodies against TG, or TG antibodies, TGAB, are present in about 1/4 of individuals with thyroid cancer, and about 10% of the general population have them as well, so that's still obviously a large number of people. These antibodies may interfere with a traditional immunoassay for thyroglobulin, which you can see here on the right-hand side. If we have thyroglobulin here in the center, and if there's autoantibodies that are present, remember there's several epitopes, so they could be binding at multiple locations all around the protein. So as depicted here, those antibodies could then block the ability of thyroglobulin to bind to the capture antibody, or it could block the ability of the detection antibody to bind. Either way, we're left with a falsely low thyroglobulin result in this particular case. And this has been a well-known issue for thyroglobulin assays, immunoassays, for many years. Accurate measurement of thyroglobulin for monitoring patients that have these antibodies has been a real issue. So let's think about some newer tools to address this issue. So namely, we're going to talk about mass spectrometry. So this is one example of a mass spec assay that's been developed by our group that addresses this thyroglobulin antibody interference. It's performed using 2D liquid chromatography and tandem mass spectrometry. So I wanted to give a really broad overview of how this type of assay actually works and how it addresses the presence of these antibodies. So we'll start with a sample where we obviously want to measure thyroglobulin, and that sample may or may not have thyroglobulin antibodies present. We actually add in even more antibodies to enrich for thyroglobulin, and then we precipitate those complexes out. So to the enriched preparation, we then add trypsin, which digests every protein that's basically present in that sample. And that would of course include thyroglobulin autoantibodies if they were present. So the proteins then are cleaved and we're left with these individual peptide fragments. The next step involves a magnetic bead, which has an antibody that's specific for one of those peptide sequences. It's a peptide sequence that's found only in thyroglobulin. So that's our target peptide that we want to analyze. The beads are added to the trypsin digest, and then they'll specifically pull out just that one peptide sequence. So then we pull the beads out with a magnet, we elute off the peptide, and then we inject the whole thing into the 2D LC tandem mass spec system. So you can see that any antibodies that might have been present won't cause interference with this type of measurement because of that digestion step. So let's see if that's true. Let's look at some actual patient comparisons. So let's start by talking about patients that do not have any of these interfering autoantibodies. So these are method comparisons between the mass spec method I just showed you and the immunoassay that we currently use on the y-axis. So you can see rather good agreement all along the measurement range. And if we zoom in just on those lower concentrations, especially those even down lower where they're important for diagnosis, we can actually see quite good agreement between the methods. Now we'll look at samples that have known autoantibodies. So you can see the correlation starts to fall apart here. So mass spec values are reporting much higher than the immunoassay results. And this should make sense because we've predicted that the antibodies will interfere with the immunoassay and cause falsely low results. So without that interference, then the mass spec assay, the values would be much higher. So again, if we zoom in just on those low concentrations, we see that mass spec is actually able to report values in a large number of samples that were considered negative by immunoassay. So all those data points that kind of lay flat on the bottom of the graph. We actually saw that almost a quarter of samples that were negative by immunoassay had values that were above 0.5 nanograms per mil by mass spec. Overall, we see worse agreement at thyroglobulin concentrations below 2 nanograms per mil. So you'll remember that this is a critical decision limit, as thyroglobulin concentrations above this concentration can indicate recurrent or residual disease. So people are looking at these concentrations very carefully, very frequently. They're using them for monitoring. So we're hoping that this is providing more useful information for monitoring in these particular patients that have antibodies present. So I wanted to take this a step further and just talk about test utilization for a moment. So we're talking about designing and developing all these new and improved mass spec methods. So I wanted to talk about how they're actually being used and if we're using them properly. So you can see from the data that I just presented that the preferred measurement for thyroglobulin in patients that have antibodies would be mass spectrometry. And I also showed you that when patients are negative for thyroglobulin antibodies, there's actually quite good agreement between the mass spec and the immunoassay. So the immunoassay performs quite well in those cases. Because of that, we and other laboratories have implemented a testing algorithm that's reflexed based on the thyroglobulin antibody status of the patient. So thyroglobulin antibodies are tested first. If the sample is negative for those antibodies, then it's appropriate to have the thyroglobulin measured by immunoassay. If you're thyroglobulin antibody positive, then the sample would be reflexed to testing for thyroglobulin by mass spectrometry. So why bother going through all of these extra steps? Well, you can probably guess there's a price differential here. So we would assume that proper utilization in this case could lead to some pretty substantial financial savings. I'll also point out that clients do have the option to bypass this algorithm and they can go straight to testing by mass spectrometry if they choose. And so we'll talk about that more in the next slide. So we looked at this a little bit more closely with actual testing that's being performed in our laboratories. We analyzed over 100,000 orders for thyroglobulin testing, and of these, almost 90% were ordered using that reflex testing that I just outlined. Of these, almost 90% were, in fact, thyroglobulin antibody negative. So that means that these were good candidates for immunoassay. So reflexing to immunoassay, instead of ordering mass spec alone with no antibody screening, saved over $3 million. So that dollar figure is actually based on an average list price of thyroglobulin by mass spectrometry from 3 different commercial laboratories. So that's list price. So let's say that for this subset of samples, the clinician is aware of the possible interference by thyroglobulin antibodies, but they would like to have their thyroglobulin measured by mass spectrometry. So what if they were to just order thyroglobulin antibodies and thyroglobulin by mass spectrometry at the same time? So then they would know the antibody status of the patient, so that's good. But by not waiting for that result first and using immunoassay if the patient was negative, which I've shown you the vast majority of patients are, those numbers would add up to almost $9 million more than testing by using that reflex algorithm. So that's a hypothetical, and obviously those numbers are big because that was the biggest subset of the data that we looked at. The rest of the orders were ordered separately for thyroglobulin antibody and thyroglobulin by mass spectrometry, so that remaining 11%. As we would predict, the majority of these were also antibody negative. So mass spectrometry testing was performed in these cases when it wasn't necessarily needed. So for this subset, reflexing to immunoassay would have saved almost $250,000. So we're showing here that just doing mass spectrometry isn't enough. We have to think about the proper ways to implement and the proper ways to use these results. So we've shown that mass spectrometry allows for an accurate measurement of thyroglobulin in the presence of these interfering thyroglobulin autoantibodies, and that utilizing mass spec assays when they're most appropriate leads to the best and most economical use of healthcare resources. So in summary, we've talked about the fact that thyroglobulin has utility in the diagnosis and monitoring of thyroid cancer recurrence. LC tandem mass spec technology allows for the measurement of thyroglobulin in the presence of these autoantibodies that have been known to interfere with immunoassays. And proper test utilization in both thyroglobulin antibody positive and negative populations can help us lead to substantial cost savings. I'd like to acknowledge individuals that have been involved in these particular studies, and I'd like to thank you for your time.